Welcome to this special episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. In today's episode, I am joined by Abby Smith, who is a participant in the Menzies Early Career Network. This network has given Australian university students the opportunity to engage with the history of the Menzies era, meet like-minded peers and respected figures in the field of Australian political history. As part of their involvement in the program, the 2024 participants contributed chapters to our upcoming book, Finding Menzies, a new generation's inspiration for foreign affairs, social policy and political thought. In today's episode, I will be talking to Abby about her chapter, Creating the Middle Class Economy, How Inflation Targeting and Child Endowment Changed Australia's Trajectory. Abby, great topic, really interesting, unique topic. Can you tell me why you chose it?
The reason I chose this topic is really that economics drives people's politics. I always say there's two layers. You have the politic, and then on top is the economic. And Menzies really, I think, understood that there was a group of people that felt politically distant from Canberra, and that was because their economic circumstances were not being taken into account by policies. You sort of see the left sort of looking more towards that working class, and the right really looking more towards that affluent class, leaving a bunch of people in the middle that had ambitions and dreams, but weren't being heard and policies not being enacted to support them. And I think that really resonates in the political scene now, where people still have that, where their economic circumstances drives their political vote or which way they would decide to vote in an upcoming election.
It's an interesting characterization, and I guess has been tested in recent years with the rise of the teals and the trend of highly educated and let's sort of stereotype highly affluent people shifting left, and so their sort of economic circumstances perhaps are less of a determining factor of their political views than they once had been. A story for another day, perhaps. But you write about the middle class economy, which is an interesting concept. Tell me what it means.
So, in the idea during Menzies' time, the middle class economy was essentially the differentiation between a blue collar and a white collar worker. So, you sort of see these small businesses that are getting sort of left behind, government policies not keeping up with them, and then sort of being hit by lacking response, particularly around inflation, where you sort of see this blue collar economy that's getting supported by the government. And then you sort of see the upper class getting supported by the government. So you get that sort of big gap where it's a lot of collar workers that maybe not a part of a unionized workforce, that are getting left behind. That's sort of that middle class economy. Where now we sort of see it more in numerical terms. So it's about 50,000 up to 130 to 180,000 where we see that middle class where it's been numericalized. But under Menzies' time, it was particularly around where people worked and what they did for a living.
And how was this different from the, I guess, previous governments and previous eras of Australia, this sort of development of a middle class economy?
I think governments really thrived sort of off that Marxist dichotomy of the working class and so that more affluent class and
Bourgeoisie.
bourgeoisie, yes. And you sort of see that sort of dichotomy, and that's what most politicians worked with. They either supported one or the other, and people in that middle ground really weren't being touched. They weren't really understood. And I don't think people really saw that middle ground. And I think Menzies' vision sort of went, oh, well, I'm sort of a part of this. I sort of see myself in this, or I see myself reflected in these people, sort of opened up that gap that a lot of politicians had because they didn't really see the middle as a viable gain for them.
Mm. Was there a sense that Menzies himself was an example of social mobility too? Do you think that influenced him? I mean, he's coming from very humble beginnings in Japarat in Western Victoria. His father's a shopkeeper, becomes a local MP, but they certainly are not overly endowed with wealth, and the educational opportunities he was able to attain were due to scholarships, not because his family could afford them.
Like, yeah, I agree with that. I think his your upbringing, your personal circumstance does lead to your political or motivations and the way you see policy. And I think Menzies saw that social mobility was achievable. I think you sort of see this left where it's like the poor is always going to be poor, you're going to be stuck here, there's no one's looking after you, you need all these benefits. Where I think Menzies went, no, if you work hard, you get these opportunities, they can arise to you having social mobility. And I think, yeah, his personal circumstance clearly showed the way that that was against what was the norm at the time or the understood norm.
And what about this sense of growing the pie that he was very intent on, that we shouldn't just be content with the economy to be a certain size, and then okay, if some portion, the affluent are getting more of the pie and the working class are getting less of the pie, we need to kind of cut it up differently so that it's more equal. He was much more keen on seeing the pie just get bigger for everyone.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think he sort of saw that the middle class was really the opportunity to grow the pie, and it was growing the pie from the middle. The middle class had a lot of energy to make a difference, to participate in the economy. And he went, these are the people that are willing to do more for the economy. We sort of see the lower income, they're a bit more, their propensity to spend a bit less, their propensity to invest in the economy that they didn't really trust was quite low. And you saw the affluent class, which was quite small in terms of its population, putting all this money in, but the return or was it in their best interest to do so was very limited because they weren't getting much back from governments for it, depending who was in power. So I think seeing and growing the pie from the middle, I think was a game changer for the Australian economy. And I think it's really shown in the decades past, Menzies really was particularly in relation to small businesses, which are the lifeblood of many towns and many suburbs in Australia.
So you focus in your chapter on two particular policies that are sort of designed to target this middle class economy. One is bringing down inflation, and the other is child endowment. Can we start with inflation? I mean, been a problem these days, obviously out of COVID and with huge government spending programs. We saw inflation spike, and that's attacked cost of living. So people are pretty familiar now that with the fact that inflation is a problem and we want to avoid it. But talk about the early 1950s when Menzies had to tackle this issue.
Well, when Menzies tackled this issue, it was really looking at there was sort of two parts to it. That wage increases were helping inflation grow, and that's sort of what we're seeing at the moment, where there's this homegrown inflation, and the economy sort of needs to halt. And then you sort of see as well. You sort of see imported inflation through our exports and all that. What was happening in the overseas situation. So with Menzies and how he tackled inflation, it was the horror budget, as some might say, um, really was about allowing people to get the best out of the money they earned. And that's what inflation targeting is. And that's what Menzies inflation targeting was understanding that when inflation went up, people's propensity to spend was very low. People only spent
Mm.
on what they could. There wasn't much savings for capital projects. People didn't want to invest in the economy. And that really impacted the growth of the economy. And I think when you look at back at the policies and the sort of the commentary around the budget that he did in relation to inflation was very about wasn't understanding that this is going to help us in the long term. They sort of went, well, inflation's going up, we've got to match wages. Like there wasn't that understanding of the beast that inflation is. And I think Menzies really saw that. And the inflation targeting was around lowering inflation to allow people the best opportunity to invest their funds where they wanted to and not be trapped sort of by this boogeyman in the economy.
And it's interesting he used in his advocacy for his policy, so obviously massively cutting government spending, hence the horror budget, which was taking away inflationary pressures in the economy. He was using as a kind of salutary tale the story of Germany, wasn't he?
Yeah, so you sort of saw Germany and looking at that sort of post-World War One era where they sort of put all this money into the economy and then they had the corruption and everything sort of went backwards. And I think and seeing people on the streets and those impacts really, I think, stuck with Menzies. And when we can't go down this way, it pushes everyone backwards. I think you see what comes out of Germany and the Nazi regime as being another threat to the economic stability and the political stability of a country. And I think you sort of see those two hand in hand, how it does cause, you get that economic unrest, but there's social unrest underneath it. So I really think he saw inflation as both an economic stabilizer to improve growth, but also as a social stabilizer. Yes, people in the short term aren't going to be happy with the way this budget is operated, but at the end of the day, in the long term, it's going to allow for long term growth, long term stability, and that allows for social stability.
How did the public respond to his horror budget? I mean, it was called a horror budget. It's not great headlines. You don't want that in the, the Age or the Sydney Morning
No,
Herald. And the Labor opposition obviously attacked this pretty forcefully.
I think the public perception was a lot of people were very angered by it. They didn't understand. I think because previous budgets just tried to keep up with inflation. They're like, inflation's going up. We've got to spend more. We've got to help people. And I think he really reversed sort of the notion around budgets. I think that really changed the trajectory of future budgets. Where we sort of see there was an article comparing Joe Hockey's budget to Menzies' horror budget, saying, "Oh, they're cutting all these services, and it's this bit." People, I think, were a bit more like, "Oh, we understand because we don't want inflation. There's all these things." But I think back when Menzies did it, people didn't understand. The governments just put in money and they hoped for the best. Where taking out money was was very rare and wasn't. It was sort of brought up later on by Hayek, a bit around inflationary pressures and the impacts on budgets and spending, where a lot of budgets had more of a Keynesian sort of
Mm.
notion, sort of coming out of the Great Depression. So I think the school of thought was Keynesian, you get put in money and everything's going to work out fine. And I think that was the expectation. He went against public expectations, and that angered people because people expected support but didn't realize inflation targeting actually is a sense of support.
But he still got re-elected, so
And
yeah.
yeah,
um, what about child endowment? I mean, this was a policy that Enid Lyons had advocated strongly for, and of course, the Menzies had introduced it initially in the early 1940s, and then again in the 1949 election takes a sort of improved child endowment policy. But I mean, this was very targeted. This policy, wasn't it?
very targeted towards women in the middle class. And essentially, what it did was it was separated wages from sort of social support. Because at the time, the norm was that your social support was tied to wages, and most men were the breadwinners or out working. So it was tied to them, and it increased with when inflationary pressures happened, it increased. What Menzies did was, and what the child endowment did was take it off the wages, place it on the woman, and allowed her to have autonomy, allowed her to have the opportunity to invest in herself, but also her children, her family, and it actually allowed for greater growth within the economy. Women tend to be that sort of economic driver within families, historically and to this day, and you sort of see how that movement or shift of money helped increase middle class families, helped lower class families to get education. And that's one of the biggest single drivers to individual growth and development, and also becoming more productive in the economy. So it was shifting that perception of, oh, it's tied to the man, he gets this, he's supporting his family, where that shift to women increased her productivity and ability to invest, but also her family's future as well.
Yeah, it's interesting, this sort of idea of the child endowment policy being a bit of a safety net, that it then would encourage, well, more economic participation, but also risk taking. And there was less of a focus on the breadwinner's job, as you say, the father, and that sort of incentive that had been previously there, that the breadwinner had to take the safest job, not the best job, but the safest job. So perhaps then the father was able to take a better job, but maybe not as secure, knowing that there was this safety net of the child endowment going to the mother.
Yeah, definitely. I think you see a bit of a shift in the way people did. You see a lot of the middle class opening up small businesses. You see a lot of growth in different areas because there was those opportunities to diversify. And I
Mm.
think what not having child endowment has sort of led Australia down a narrow path in terms of industry and what was the government supporting at the time, where you sort of see a shift more into the private sector and that risk taking. And I think this was sort of a stepping stone to allowing that.
Yeah. Abby, great chapter. Thank you so much for your efforts on this. And thank you for your participation in the Menzies Early Career Network.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.